On an ordinary August night in 2013, a young college student began a drive that should have brought him safely home. Instead, it became the beginning of one of California's most perplexing missing person mysteries. There are disappearances that shake a family, and then there are disappearances that shake anyone who hears them. Stories where the timeline is documented, the details are known, the pieces seem to be right there on the table, yet somehow the picture refuses to come together. Stories where nothing is hidden, yet nothing makes sense. Where the trail doesn't end quietly, it simply breaks. The case that begins on this night is one of those. It starts with a drive, long, winding, and increasingly inexplicable, moving down the spine of California, through small towns, empty interstates, and stretches of darkness where the only sound is a car engine humming beneath the weight of something unspoken. A drive that at first seemed harmless, routine even. A trip any college student might make at the end of a stressful week. But somewhere along that route, something changed. The young man behind the wheel wasn't running from the law. He wasn't being followed. He wasn't lost. He wasn't intoxicated. In fact, he had planned to be home with his family, planned to have a normal conversation, a normal reunion, a normal break from the rhythm of school. Yet as the hours unfolded, his behavior began shifting in ways no one around him expected. His friends noticed it first, the odd comments, the subtle distance, the strange decisions that didn't align with the person they knew. And on this night, those behaviors escalated into a series of choices that left everyone, his parents, his friends, and eventually investigators, grasping for explanations that simply weren't there. His parents believed he was on his way home. His voice on the phone sounded calm, even reassuring. He said he was coming. He said he was fine. But the truth was far murkier. For hours, he drove south, only to stop, then sit, then wait. Not for minutes, but for long, puzzling stretches of time that defied logic. Hours parked in isolated places. Hours in which he made no move to rest, no move to turn back, no move to continue forward. He simply sat in his car, motionless, with no clear reason why. When someone approached him, a stranger who tried to help, he seemed polite, coherent, even friendly. He didn't appear distressed. He didn't appear confused. Yet he also didn't seem willing to leave. As the night stretched into the early morning and the early morning stretched into daylight, the young man stayed planted in the same spot, as though trapped in a moment he couldn't explain. It's the kind of detail that feels like the start of an answer, until you realize it's only the beginning of the questions, because a few hours later, he did get back on the road. He continued toward his destination, inching closer to the place where he told his parents he'd be waiting. And then, in one of the most bewildering reversals in missing person history, he turned around, circled back, repeated the same pattern again. To investigators, this wasn't the behavior of someone fleeing something external. It wasn't the path of someone being chased. Instead, it looked more like a silent internal struggle, one no one knew he was having. And then came the final leg of the journey. A stretch of highway bordered by steep hillsides and heavy brush, a lonely area near the Castaic Lake recreation area, quiet, remote, and easy to overlook at night. A place that has seen its share of accidents, its share of strange stories, its share of forgotten vehicles abandoned along the shoulder. But nothing quite like this, because as dawn approached, someone spotted an overturned SUV near an embankment by the lake. The car had tumbled down a slope, landing on its side, wedged against the earth. It was battered, cracked, and empty, but not empty in the usual sense, empty in a way that carried a chill. there was no driver. Inside the vehicle were personal belongings that any young traveler would carry: a wallet, a phone, identification, everyday items left behind as though the driver had stepped out for a moment and planned to return. The back window, investigators later noted, had been shattered, not by the crash, but from the inside. Whoever was behind the glass had forced their way out and then vanished. Search teams quickly descended on the area. The terrain around the lake was unforgiving: rugged hills, thick brush, and deep waters that reflect the sky but hide what lies beneath. Volunteers, dogs, helicopters, divers, all combed the landscape, expecting at any moment to find a clue, a trail, footprints, clothing, anything that would show which direction the young man had gone. But the land stayed silent. The traces they hoped to find simply weren't there. No prints, no blood, no sign that someone had wandered off injured, no sign of anyone running, nothing that pointed toward foul play, nothing that pointed toward a planned disappearance, nothing that lined up cleanly with the hours that came before. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The missing driver wasn't known to be violent. He had no history of vanishing acts. He wasn't the type to shut down communication. And yet, on this night, he embarked on a path of unpredictable movement, unexplained stops, and choices that even now remain among the most baffling behavioral shifts in modern missing person investigations. What makes this case unforgettable is not just the disappearance itself, but the precision of the timeline leading up to it. Phone calls, receipts, witness statements, GPS pings, roadside assistance logs. Dozens of small factual details that should have led to a resolution, and yet somehow every route leads back to the same dead end. A young man's car overturned near a lake. The driver missing, and a mystery that has endured for more than a decade. This case challenges investigators because it's built not on a lack of information, but on a lack of explanation. The pieces are there, they just don't fit. Not in a way that forms a clear picture, not in a way that brings closure. Tonight, we retrace the steps of that night. We examine the shifts in behavior. We look at the evidence, we listen to the voices of those who searched, and we explore the unanswered questions that continue to shadow this case today. But before we do, we start at the beginning. Before the unusual behavior, before the long drive, before the moment the car was found at the foot of an embankment. Because to understand the night of the disappearance, we first have to understand the young man himself. The life he lived, the relationships that shaped him, and the days leading up to the moment everything changed. In Part 2, we reveal his name, and the story of who he was and who he was becoming before the night he went missing. To understand the weight of this case, the emotional gravity that has held public attention for more than a decade, we have to step back from the crash site, away from the overturned SUV near Castaic Lake, away from the long, lonely drive that preceded it, and return to the beginning, to the life of the young man at the center of this story. His name was Bryce Laspisa. 19 years old, a college student living in Northern California, and by every account, someone whose personality left an impression wherever he went. Bryce wasn't a background figure in anyone's memory. He was expressive, talented, artistic, and charismatic in a way that made people gravitate toward him. He was a son loved deeply by his parents, a friend welcomed warmly in every circle he entered, and a young man whose future seemed full of possibility. Bryce was born in Illinois, an only child to his parents, Mike and Karen Laspisa, two people who shaped their lives around their son with the kind of love that was present in every photo, every story, every memory shared in the years after he vanished. When Bryce was still in high school, the family moved west, settling in Laguna Niguel, California. A fresh start, a new home closer to family and opportunities. Bryce adapted effortlessly. He was social, bright, and known for his sense of humor. The type of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and walk out with friends. In 2012, he began attending Sierra College in Rockland, about 400 miles north of his parents' home. He studied graphic and industrial design, fields that fit naturally with his creative mind. Professors saw talent in him. Friends admired his artwork, and socially he thrived. He made close friendships, spent time hanging out in student apartments, played video games late into the night, and enjoyed the independence that comes with early college life. Bryce's parents later described him as happy, enthusiastic, enjoying his classes, and doing well academically. There was no sign, none at all, that the coming year would bring confusion, fear, and unanswered questions. But the truth about missing person stories is that they rarely begin at the moment someone disappears. They begin in the small shifts beforehand, the subtle changes in behavior, the decisions that, in hindsight, feel like quiet warnings. And for Bryce, those shifts emerged in the days leading up to August 30th, 2013. His friends noticed it before anyone else. During the last week of August, Bryce's demeanor started to change. He seemed restless, distracted, not quite himself. Close friends later said he looked tired, not physically, but mentally, as though something was weighing on him, something he wasn't explaining. Bryce wasn't withdrawn or hostile. He wasn't angry or upset. Instead, it was something harder to define, a shift in mood, a sense that he wasn't entirely present. Like many college students, Bryce occasionally drank alcohol, and there are reports that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, he tried Vyvanse, a prescription stimulant not prescribed to him. Friends would later share these concerns with investigators, but it's important to emphasize, nothing in his behavior suggested violence, danger, or an intention to disappear. These were the kinds of concerns that make friends check in, not the kind that make them fear what was coming. Still, the changes were noticeable. On August 27th, only a few days before the disappearance, Bryce texted his girlfriend to say she'd be better off without him. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't triggered by anything dramatic. It simply came out of nowhere, unexpected, uncharacteristic, and emotionally heavy in a way that didn't match the events around him. When she asked him why he felt that way, Bryce had no clear answer. The next morning, he told her he wanted to end the relationship. His girlfriend, understandably worried, asked him to meet in person. Something didn't feel right. She later described Bryce as acting off, different from the person she knew. Concerned for his safety, she took his car keys and begged him not to drive until he was thinking clearly. But Bryce insisted he was fine. Eventually, she returned the keys, and Bryce left. This was one of the first moments where concern began transforming into fear, the kind of fear only close friends truly notice. Later that same day, Bryce's roommate also felt something was wrong. He became concerned enough to call Bryce's mother directly, a call college roommates rarely make without strong reason. He told her Bryce wasn't acting like himself, that his behavior was strange, unsettling. There was no crisis, no incident, but the shift was there, and impossible to ignore. When Karen Laspisa spoke with Bryce that evening, she reassured her that everything was fine. She insisted he was okay. He claimed he simply had a lot on his mind. Parents know when something feels off, but sometimes they also know when pushing too hard might close a door instead of opening one. So Karen listened, checked in, and trusted that whatever Bryce was going through, he was still grounded enough to be honest if things got worse. Except they did get worse, and Bryce didn't say it. In the 48 hours before his disappearance, Bryce gave away personal items, including his video game console. He made unsettling comments, and he distanced himself from people he cared about. And he seemed to be preparing for something, though no one, not even Bryce himself, ever expressed what that something was. These weren't decisions made in panic or anger. They were decisions that felt almost resigned, calm, quiet, as though Bryce was moving through a fog only he could see. But even through this shift in his behavior, one thing remained constant. Bryce was in touch with his parents. He answered the phone. He spoke clearly. He said he planned to come home. Whatever he was grappling with internally, he wasn't shutting anyone out. And that's what makes the timeline haunting. Bryce was not a young man who slipped away silently.
He wasn't someone who hid his movements. He wasn't someone who cut ties. In the hours leading up to the drive, he spoke with multiple people, each conversation leaving them uncertain, uneasy, and wondering what was happening beneath the surface. By the night of August 28th, Bryce's pattern of unusual behavior had stretched long enough that both his girlfriend and roommate felt something was seriously wrong. They urged him to stay, to wait, to rest. But Bryce didn't. He insisted on going somewhere, though he didn't say where. His keys were returned, he got into his vehicle, a 2003 Toyota Highlander, and drove away. That was the beginning of the journey, a journey that spanned hundreds of miles, a journey documented by phone calls, credit card receipts, and witness interactions, a journey that should have ended safely in Southern California, but didn't. What happened next would become one of the most puzzling timelines in modern missing person investigations, a series of movements that seemed logical on the surface, yet made no sense when connected together. A drive that stretched not just through the length of California, but through the boundaries of reason itself.
By the time the sun set on August 29, 2013, the shifts in Bryce Laspisa's behavior had built into a quiet storm. Those closest to him recognized that something wasn't right, but no one, not his friends, not his girlfriend, not even his parents, could have predicted the chain of events that would unfold over the next 24 hours. What began as an ordinary night in Rockland would become a timeline studied, re-examined, and revisited for more than a decade. And it began with a simple act. Bryce got into his car and started driving. He left his apartment late on the 28th, telling his roommate he had a lot to talk about. Where he intended to go, or who he intended to talk to, remains uncertain. What is known is that his car moved south onto Interstate 5, the long highway that runs the length of California. His destination was presumably his parents' home in Laguna Niguel. He had told them earlier in the week that he wanted to come home. He made no mention of any other plans. Around 11 p.m., Bryce called his mother. His voice was steady, calm. He told her he was going to drive home the next morning. Karen, sensing something was off but trusting her son's words, agreed. Nothing about that conversation suggested what was coming. But Bryce didn't wait for morning. Overnight, he continued driving, alone, through long, empty stretches of interstate, lit only by the glow of passing headlights and the hum of late-night truck traffic. He moved deeper into the state, mile by mile, hour by hour. There was nothing unusual about his driving pattern. His route was direct, consistent, and exactly where one would expect him to be. Then, sometime around dawn, everything changed. By early morning on August 29th, phone records and credit card activity placed Bryce near Buttonwillow, a small, quiet town along Interstate 5, about halfway between Rockland and Orange County. It's the kind of place where most travelers stop for gas, food, or bathroom breaks. But Bryce didn't stop to refuel or rest. He simply stopped. Just past 9 a.m., Bryce's Toyota Highlander was spotted in a parking area owned by a roadside service company. The car wasn't broken down. It wasn't damaged. It was simply parked. And inside, Bryce sat alone, awake, alert, doing nothing. Hours passed. By early afternoon, Bryce had not moved from that spot. His parents, unable to reach him, grew concerned. They checked his phone records and saw that he was still hours away. That's when they decided to call the business directly, the same company whose lot Bryce was parked in. A man named Christian, who worked for the roadside service company, agreed to check on him. It's one thing to hear about someone sitting in a parked car for hours. It's another to walk up and see it. When Christian approached Bryce, he found him sitting upright, coherent, and friendly. He explained that he was just relaxing. There was no sign of distress, no indication of an emergency. He didn't appear intoxicated or injured. He wasn't asleep. He simply wasn't moving. Still concerned, Christian later returned with a gas can after Bryce's parents asked him to fill the tank in case their son was low on fuel. Bryce paid for the gas. He thanked him. He smiled. And then he stayed exactly where he was. Hours continued to pass. At this point, Bryce's parents were becoming significantly worried. Why was their son sitting in Buttonwillow? Why hadn't he continued his drive? What was happening that he wasn't explaining? By early evening, they asked Christian for help again. He agreed. This time, when Christian approached Bryce, he found him unchanged, calm, polite, clear-spoken, and still unwilling or unable to leave. When asked directly if he needed assistance, he insisted he didn't. When asked if he was waiting for someone, he shook his head. He said he was fine. He said nothing unusual was happening. But the pattern said otherwise. Bryce had now been in Buttonwillow for nearly 9 hours. Worried about his state of mind, Christian called Bryce's mother while standing next to him. He handed Bryce the phone so they could speak directly. Bryce told her he was heading home. He promised he'd be there by 3 a.m. But once again, he didn't move. The next time Bryce's phone pinged, it revealed he was still in the Buttonwillow area. He had traveled only a short distance, then stopped again. It was as though he was circling the edges of a decision he couldn't make. At 1 a.m., nearly 16 hours after leaving his apartment, Bryce finally got back on the interstate. For 2 hours he drove normally. He passed through Grapevine, descended from the Tehachapi Mountains, and headed toward Los Angeles County. His parents, exhausted but relieved, waited for him at home. He told them he was coming. They believed him. His phone showed he was heading their way. But then, at 2:09 a.m., Bryce made another surprising call. This time, to tell his mother that he was too tired to continue. He said he was going to pull over and rest. Karen urged him to stop at a safe location. She trusted his judgment. After all, he'd been awake for nearly 24 hours. But when investigators later traced his movements, the truth emerged. Bryce didn't pull over to rest. He kept driving, and not toward home. Sometime between 2:30 and 4 a.m., Bryce turned off Interstate 5, took Lake Hughes Road, and entered the Castaic Lake recreation area, a rural, isolated region of steep hills, rugged terrain, and darkness so deep that headlights reveal only what's directly ahead. Why he went there, no one knows. It was not on the route to his parents' home. It was not a rest location. It was not a place he had business or reason to visit. What happened next marks the last confirmed moments of Bryce's presence. Around 4:29 a.m., his cell phone made its final known ping near Castaic Lake, near the access roads that weave through the hills, near the place where his overturned car would later be found. By that point, Bryce had been awake for more than 30 hours. His behavior, though outwardly calm, was spiraling into levels that friends and family had never seen before. But even then, nothing pointed toward violence, self-harm, or a desire to disappear. Everything about his actions, however strange, remained carefully controlled. And then, in the hours between darkness and dawn, everything stopped. Sometime after 4:30 a.m., Bryce's Toyota Highlander drove up a service road near the lake, through a remote area used mostly by maintenance workers and emergency responders. The car traveled toward a point overlooking an embankment, a steep slope that dropped down toward the brushy shore below. Whether Bryce paused on that slope,
Whether he hesitated, whether he considered turning back, no one knows. What is known is that the vehicle went over the edge. It rolled down the hill, flipped, and came to rest near the bottom, on its side, battered, silent, still. The airbags deployed. The front windshield cracked. The engine shut off. And Bryce Laspisa was gone. The timeline up to this moment is documented, verified, and still studied today. But the moment the crash occurred and everything that came after marks the point where the mystery begins its descent into uncertainty. Because the next discovery would only raise more questions. And no answers.
Morning light came slowly to the Castaic Lake recreation area on August 30th, 2013. The first rays washed over rugged hillsides, quiet dirt roads, and the still surface of the reservoir below. It was the kind of morning that looked peaceful, almost deceptively so, considering what investigators were about to find there. Not long after sunrise, a park ranger on patrol noticed something unusual off the main access road, the glint of metal where metal shouldn't be. Down a steep embankment, partially hidden by brush and angled awkwardly against the slope, was an overturned SUV. It was a 2003 Toyota Highlander, the same vehicle Bryce Laspisa had been driving. From above, the scene looked like a severe accident. A car teetering against gravity, its undercarriage exposed, its front end crushed, its alignment warped by the force of the tumble. But as soon as the ranger radioed for assistance and responders approached the wreck, they realized something far stranger was unfolding. The vehicle was empty. The windshield was cracked. The airbags had deployed, but there was no driver. And in the back of the SUV, investigators found something that sent a jolt of unease through everyone on scene. Bryce's wallet, Bryce's phone, and Bryce's personal belongings, all untouched, all undisturbed, all waiting for a driver who wasn't there. Inside, there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of a head injury. Nothing to indicate that someone had attempted to remove Bryce by force. The driver's seat wasn't pushed back or angled strangely. The airbags had protected the cabin well, leaving no immediate sign that the driver would have been critically injured. Then came the detail that would become one of the most haunting elements of the case. The only window broken on the SUV was broken from the inside. The rear window, shattered outward, suggested that the driver had kicked or pushed his way out after the crash. This wasn't the aftermath of someone trapped or incapacitated. It was the aftermath of someone conscious, active, and physically capable of extracting themselves from the vehicle. The logical next step would be to look for footprints, signs of movement, drag marks, anything that could reveal where Bryce had gone after climbing out of the vehicle. But the ground offered none. Around the overturned SUV lay only disturbed brush from the crash, nothing else. No tracks leading away, no trail suggesting a direction. The soil was loose enough that fresh prints should have been visible, yet the earth was clean, untouched, silent. When deputies checked the dirt road leading down the embankment, they found the tire tracks left during the descent, but nothing more. No indication that Bryce tried to climb back up. No indication that he walked toward the lake. No indication that anyone approached the scene after the crash. It was as though Bryce had stepped out of the vehicle and vanished into thin air. Law enforcement immediately initiated a search. Castaic Lake, though beautiful, is unforgiving terrain. Steep, dry hillsides on one side,
cold, deep water on the other. The slopes are covered in thick chaparral, knee-high brush, and ragged rocks. In many areas, visibility is low, footing is unstable, and wandering alone, especially injured or disoriented, can become dangerous within minutes. Deputies used ATVs to comb the dirt roads. Search and rescue teams moved through the brush. Divers were called to sweep the water. Helicopters hovered overhead, scanning for movement or heat signatures. The hours passed, then the day passed, and still nothing. No clothing, no phone, no footprints, no broken branches that might indicate someone traveling through the brush. No signs of a body, living or deceased. The crash should have given investigators something to work with. Instead, it deepened the mystery. The embankment where the SUV was found was steep, but not insurmountable. A healthy 19-year-old could have climbed it, even in shock. But the absence of any evidence made it difficult to determine if Bryce tried. The lake itself was searched extensively, multiple times, with dogs trained for water recovery, sonar equipment, and divers experienced in challenging aquatic terrain. Nothing indicated that Bryce had entered the lake at all. When Bryce's parents arrived on scene later that day, they were met not with answers, but with a series of unsettling facts. Their son's vehicle had crashed. He had survived the crash.
He had gotten out. He had left everything behind. And he was nowhere to be found. From there, the focus shifted to reconstructing the final decisions Bryce made before the crash. Investigators returned to the spot where the vehicle went over the embankment. The tracks showed that the car had traveled down the service road at a moderate speed before veering off. There was no evidence of braking. The trajectory suggested intent, but not necessarily conscious intent. A driver who fell asleep at the wheel, for example, might leave similar marks. But the absence of skid marks didn't necessarily reveal motive. It only revealed that the vehicle had not stopped, not slowed. It simply went over. The next question investigators asked was just as important. When did Bryce leave the vehicle? The crash likely occurred around 4:30 a.m., the time of his last phone ping. Given the lack of injuries inside the car and the broken rear window, it was clear he was alert enough to escape. That meant the window was broken shortly after the crash. But what happened in the minutes, hours, or moments afterward remains unknown. Did Bryce walk away voluntarily? Did he wander while dazed? Was he injured in a way that wasn't visible inside the car? Did someone encounter him? Or did he simply keep walking until he disappeared into terrain that hides movement easily? Investigators considered each possibility, but none aligned cleanly with the facts. No one found signs of someone resting or sleeping in the area. No one found clothing snagged on brush. No one reported seeing a young man walking the roads early that morning. No surveillance footage captured him on nearby highways or businesses. Bryce Laspisa had been in constant contact with others for nearly 24 hours. Friends, parents, the roadside worker in Buttonwillow. Yet after 4:30 a.m., not a single confirmed sighting existed. It was as though the earth had swallowed him. In the hours that followed, the search expanded beyond the immediate crash site. Bloodhounds picked up a faint trail, one that suggested Bryce had walked a short distance around the lake, but the trail ended abruptly, without direction or continuation. It could have been a real trace of his path, or it could have been contamination. Even the dog handlers couldn't say with confidence. As afternoon turned to evening, the weight of the disappearance grew heavier. The crash had been real. The extraction from the car had been real.
But the disappearance lacked the usual indicators seen in cases of self-harm, abduction, or intentional flight. None of the typical signs were present. Everything Bryce had left behind, his wallet, his phone, his laptop, were items someone wishing to vanish might intentionally leave behind. But in Bryce's case, the items were still inside a crashed vehicle, not neatly placed, not hidden, left behind only because he climbed out quickly without taking anything. This wasn't an orchestrated disappearance. This wasn't a staged scene. And it didn't carry the hallmarks of foul play. It was simply a void. Night fell on Castaic Lake with the search still underway, and more questions than answers. The SUV remained at the bottom of the embankment, a physical reminder of the moment the timeline ended. But Bryce himself had crossed a threshold that investigators could not follow. And from that moment forward, the search for him became one of the most extensive efforts in the region's history, and one of the most perplexing.
When a vehicle is found overturned, its driver missing, and the surrounding terrain silent, the first hours are crucial. In many missing person cases, those hours define the direction of the entire investigation. At Castaic Lake on August 30th, 2013, those early hours were filled with movement, fast, coordinated, and driven by urgency. Because the moment responders confirmed that the Toyota Highlander belonged to 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, the disappearance shifted from a simple accident response to a full-scale search, and it began immediately. Within the first hour, deputies from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department established a perimeter around the crash site. It wasn't a large area. The road behind the embankment was isolated enough that limiting access was easy, but the terrain was challenging. The hillside where Bryce's SUV landed was steep, covered in dry brush that snapped loudly underfoot. Every step required balance. Every movement carried dust into the air. Search and rescue teams were called in, consisting of trained volunteers who specialized in rugged environments. Bloodhounds arrived soon after, brought in to track any scent Bryce might have left behind. Helicopters hovered above the valley, their engines echoing across the dry hills and casting long shadows across the terrain below. From the outside, it looked like the kind of operation that should deliver fast answers. But from the beginning, investigators encountered something deeply unusual. There was no trail. Bloodhounds were brought to the broken window, asked to pick up the scent from Bryce's point of exit. Normally, dogs trained in this work can follow a clear path for miles, even across rough terrain. This time, the dogs traced a short, uneven route, moving around the lake's edge, following a pattern that suggested Bryce had walked only a few hundred yards. And then, the scent stopped. Not faded, not weakened, stopped. Dog handlers repeated the process. They brought in different dogs. They extended the perimeter. Each time the result was identical. The trail existed briefly, then abruptly ended. This was not typical behavior for a lost person, nor was it typical for someone injured and wandering. In cases of disorientation, confusion, or shock, individuals often leave a meandering pattern, long wandering distances with inconsistent direction. In Bryce's case, the trail was clean, short, and ended in a place with no footprints leading further. The dog's detection area was documented, mapped, and revisited multiple times throughout the day, but it never expanded beyond that initial boundary. As the morning turned to afternoon, the operation grew. Sheriff's deputies deployed diver teams to search Castaic Lake. The water was cold, deep, and murky in places. Visibility was limited, but the divers were experienced, methodical in their approach. They swept the search area using grid patterns, covering points where currents could carry a body,
and using sonar to detect submerged objects. They found no sign of Bryce. Above the waterline, helicopters used thermal imaging, scanning the hillsides for any heat signatures. If Bryce had collapsed in the brush from exhaustion, injury, or disorientation, the thermal cameras could have picked up his presence, but the scans returned nothing. Back on land, volunteers formed search lines and walked shoulder to shoulder through thick vegetation, calling his name, pushing aside brush, examining every depression in the ground where someone might have fallen or rested. Still, nothing. The absence of evidence became the most striking part of the investigation. Missing person cases usually leave some sort of trail: footprints, clothing, discarded items, physical disturbances. But here, the ground told no story. And investigators had to consider a hard truth. Bryce may not have stayed in the area long after the crash. Yet, if he walked away quickly, if he was mobile and uninjured, why did no one see him on the roads? Lake Hughes Road connects to larger routes. Someone walking in early daylight along a rural road tends to be noticed, especially a young man alone wearing bright clothing. But no motorists reported seeing anyone matching Bryce's description. The lack of sightings troubled investigators. As the search extended into the evening, Mike and Karen Laspisa arrived at the scene. In photos taken in those early days, their faces carry the raw weight of fear and disbelief, the kind only parents of missing children truly understand. They walked the area, spoke with deputies, asked questions, and clung to the hope that their son had simply wandered off and would soon be found. But the longer the search continued without results, the more the fear grew. Teams returned the next morning, and the next, and the next. Over the following days, the operation expanded into one of the largest searches for a missing young adult in the region's history. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. Helicopters continued aerial sweeps. Marine units conducted additional dives. ATVs explored distant, difficult terrain. Search dogs were deployed again and again. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses and roadways. Though the area around Castaic Lake is remote, some businesses along Interstate 5 had cameras. They hoped to capture a figure walking along the shoulder or entering a gas station, but none of the footage showed Bryce. They checked hospitals, urgent care clinics, shelters, transit stations, nearby towns. Nothing. A few potential sightings came in, as they do in most missing person cases, but none were confirmed. In each report, the timing didn't align, or the description differed too greatly, or the individual seen couldn't be located again for verification. Among investigators, one theme began emerging. Wherever Bryce went after the crash, he left no trace. Not because he intended to disappear. There was no evidence suggesting he staged anything, but because whatever happened next occurred beyond the reach of documented evidence. Whether he walked, collapsed, hid, or continued moving, none of those actions were captured physically in a way searchers could follow. As days turned into weeks, the tone of the search shifted. The mission was still active, still driven by urgency, but the emotional weight on the community grew heavier. Volunteers who had walked miles under the California sun began to sense what many investigators already understood. The disappearance lacked a pattern. It lacked markers. It lacked the usual clues found in cases involving self-harm, abduction, or voluntary flight. This case sat in a category all its own. Investigators revisited the crash site again and again, trying to understand the moment Bryce's trail vanished. They examined the embankment, measured the descent, documented every detail of the vehicle. They confirmed once more that the rear window had been broken from the inside. They studied the interior for signs of panic,
injury, or blood, but found none. The absence of blood was particularly noteworthy. In a crash of that severity, even airbag deployment often results in minor injuries, cuts, nosebleeds, abrasions. But the airbags, though deployed, had not left visible evidence of injury. This reinforced the idea that Bryce walked away in good physical condition. Yet his decision to leave everything behind, his wallet, phone, ID, laptop, presented another challenge. It wasn't clear if Bryce intended to walk only briefly, return to the car, or head somewhere specific. But the items suggested he didn't flee with intention. These were not the actions of someone planning to start over or hide from the world. They were the actions of someone whose next move was unknown even to himself. As weeks passed, Mike and Karen continued returning to Castaic Lake. They met with search teams, pinned up flyers, spoke to local residents, and followed every lead, no matter how thin. They refused to let Bryce's name fade. Even as the official search began to scale down, the Laspisa family kept pushing, kept asking, kept searching. Their determination kept the case alive in public memory. Their hope kept the story moving, and their voice ensured Bryce would not be forgotten. But despite everything, the manpower, the resources, the urgency, the investigation reached a difficult conclusion. No physical evidence of Bryce's fate had been found. The questions that now remained were bigger, heavier, and far more complex. Why did Bryce behave the way he did in the hours before the crash? What caused his abrupt slowdown in Buttonwillow? Why did he turn off the interstate and drive into Castaic Lake's remote access roads? And how could a 19-year-old man, healthy, mobile, and bright, vanish so completely?
In the weeks following the search at Castaic Lake, investigators found themselves staring at a disappearance that seemed to collapse under its own weight. Every piece of the timeline was clear. Every major movement was documented. Every witness interaction had been verified. And yet, when all of those details were placed together, they did not form a complete picture. Instead, the case drifted into a realm of unanswered questions. Questions built not on speculation, but on the strange and undeniable facts of Bryce Laspisa's final known hours. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was the sudden shift in Bryce's behavior during the days leading up to his disappearance. Friends noticed it before anyone else. They described him as unsettled, distant, not quite connected to the world around him. His emotions seemed flat at times, then unusually heavy the next moment. He wasn't angry or volatile, just changed. He spoke differently. He acted differently. He made decisions that felt disconnected from the person they knew. Giving away personal belongings, attempting to break up with his girlfriend, and staying awake for long stretches of time, none of it aligned with the Bryce they recognized. And yet, even in those moments of strangeness, Bryce answered his phone. He spoke clearly. He reassured the people who loved him. He never lashed out, never shut anyone out completely, never expressed the kind of darkness that typically precedes a deliberate disappearance. It was as if something inside him was shifting, quietly, invisibly, in ways that only he could feel. His drive south on Interstate 5 only deepened the uncertainty. The long, unexplained stop in Buttonwillow became one of the central mysteries in the timeline. Bryce sat in or near the same parking lot for nearly 9 hours. Not sleeping, not eating, not seeking help, not continuing his journey. Just sitting, waiting, suspended in a strange stillness that neither he nor anyone around him could explain. When the roadside assistance worker approached him, Bryce appeared calm, polite, and fully aware. He wasn't confused. He wasn't slurring his words. He wasn't showing signs of panic or distress, and yet he stayed there, hour after hour, unable or unwilling to move forward. This quiet internal struggle seemed to follow him through the night. After finally leaving Buttonwillow, he drove normally for hours, getting closer and closer to his parents' home. He called them repeatedly, He sounded coherent. He said he was tired. He said he was going to rest. But the truth found later through phone records was different. He didn't stop to rest. He continued driving into the hills near Castaic Lake, into an area that made no sense for his route, an area that people rarely enter without a reason. Then came the crash. His SUV rolled down a steep embankment, flipping as it descended before coming to rest near the bottom. The airbags deployed, the cabin remained largely intact. There were no signs of major injury inside the vehicle, no blood, no physical evidence suggesting he couldn't walk away. But the most important detail was the shattered rear window. It hadn't been broken by the impact, it had been pushed outward from the inside. Bryce had climbed out of the SUV on his own. And then, everything stopped. There were no footprints leading away from the vehicle, even though the soil was the kind that should have preserved impressions. There were no signs of someone stumbling through the brush, no bits of torn clothing, no objects dropped accidentally in a rush, no direction of travel. Search dogs picked up a faint trail for a short distance along the lake, then abruptly lost it. Not gradually, not drifting into uncertainty, but stopping completely, as though the scent simply ended. It was one of the most baffling outcomes search teams had ever encountered. A person had clearly walked away, yet the landscape offered nothing to show where he went. The surrounding hills were combed repeatedly. Volunteers walked line after line under the burning sun. Dive teams searched the lake. Helicopters scanned for heat signatures. Every reasonable and reachable part of the terrain was covered, and still, not a trace of Bryce surfaced. So investigators were left with only questions. Why did Bryce's behavior change so suddenly in the days leading up to his disappearance? What caused such a dramatic shift in mood and decision-making? Why did he sit in Buttonwillow for nearly an entire day? What was happening internally that made him unable to continue his journey even when he was calm and communicative on the outside? Why did he tell his parents he was coming home only to drive into the remote hills instead? Why crash his car at Castaic Lake? Why break the rear window instead of using the doors? Why take nothing with him? Why leave a perfectly clear vehicle only to disappear within a few hundred yards of it? And how could a healthy 19-year-old, physically capable, surviving the crash, mobile, walk away from an accident scene in daylight and simply never be seen again? Every piece of evidence seems to present its own contradiction. His behavior in Buttonwillow suggests indecision, but his final drive suggests determination. His phone calls show clarity, but his route shows confusion. His exit from the SUV indicates purposeful action, but the absence of direction suggests disorientation. None of these elements conflict enough to cancel each other out, and none align tightly enough to form a single coherent explanation. Instead, the disappearance rests in a place between possibilities, a space where the facts are solid, but the meaning of those facts is elusive. Bryce's final hours suggest he may have been grappling with something deep, internal, and overwhelming, but the nature of that struggle remains unknown, and the choices he made after the crash remain unexplained. What makes Bryce's case unforgettable is not that the events were dramatic, it's that they were painfully quiet, subtle, slow. A series of small decisions that one by one led to a moment no one could have anticipated. In the end, Bryce's disappearance is not defined by theories. It is defined by the questions that linger, the ones that cannot be answered through evidence alone, the ones that echo through every recounting of his story. Where did he go? What was he experiencing in those final hours? And how can someone vanish so completely, so silently, in a place where so many people were searching? In the final part, we step into the aftermath, the long years that followed, the tireless efforts of Bryce's parents, and the reason his story continues to resonate across time.
In the days after the search at Castaic Lake slowed, the world around Mike and Karen Laspisa seemed to move on faster than they could understand. The helicopters left. The dive teams returned to their routines. Volunteers went back to work and school. Reporters shifted their focus to new stories. But for Bryce's parents, nothing moved forward. Time tightened around a single moment, the moment their only child stepped away from his crash site and disappeared into a silence no one could break. They stayed at Castaic for as long as authorities allowed. They walked the edges of the embankment, looking down at the scars in the earth where Bryce's SUV had tumbled. They studied the brush along the lake, imagining their son walking through it in the early morning light, wondering why he didn't call, wondering what he was thinking, wondering how someone who had been speaking to them only hours before could vanish without a single answer left behind. When they returned home, the house felt hollow in a way no words could properly describe. Bryce's room remained as it was. His artwork still hung on the walls. His childhood sketches, his school projects, the parts of his life that reflected his creativity and humor all remained untouched. Every corner of the home reminded them of the boy they raised, and every corner reminded them of how much they didn't know about his final hours. But Mike and Karen did not give in to despair. They turned their living room into a command center, filling it with maps, timelines, search grids, and logbooks. They worked with investigators. They spoke with private search teams. They studied everything they could find, every confirmed detail, every witness account, every inch of the terrain. They contacted organizations specializing in missing person investigations, hoping someone, somewhere, might see something that had been overlooked. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the Laspisas committed themselves to keeping Bryce's name present in the public eye. They distributed flyers up and down the state. They visited gas stations, rest stops, shelters, hospitals, and remote communities. They spoke with hikers, campers, and travelers who frequented the regions around Castaic. They gave interviews to local stations, national programs, and online publications. Their message was always the same: our son is missing, and we need your help. But as the seasons changed, so did the shape of their grief. The shock of the early days gave way to something quieter, heavier, a kind of grief that does not end because it does not have a place to land. There was no closure, no explanation, no evidence to accept. The unknown became its own kind of weight. Still, they continued searching. Every reported sighting, no matter how vague, was checked. Each one carried hope, but none brought answers. Some tips came from well-meaning people who thought they recognized Bryce. Others came from places far outside California. Some described a young man walking alone. Others mentioned someone who resembled him in shelters or distant towns. All were investigated, none were confirmed. Yet Mike and Karen kept going. They believed their son was alive. They believed he needed help, and they refused to let the world forget him. In the years that followed, Bryce's case became one of the most discussed missing person stories in the true crime community. Not because of dramatic twists, but because of the quiet, chilling simplicity of the facts. He was a young man with a promising future, loved by his family, surrounded by friends, attending college, creating art, and then one day, his life veered into a mystery that defied logic. Podcasts, documentaries, and online forums revisited his timeline repeatedly, searching for meaning in the details: the long hours in Buttonwillow, the conversations with his parents, the steady voice on the phone, the decision to drive into the hills, the crash, the shattered window, the trail that ended too soon. Each detail was clear on its own. None pointed definitively toward what happened next. Some saw his story as a cautionary tale about the fragility of mental and emotional health, especially in young adults navigating stress, pressure, and new environments. Others saw it as a reminder that sometimes a person can be suffering in silence, visible to everyone, but fully understood by no one. And many saw it simply as a human tragedy, not defined by theories or assumptions, but by the loss itself. But beyond the public discussion, the true heart of the story remained with Bryce's family. Every anniversary of his disappearance brought renewed attention from the media and renewed pain for his parents. They organized community events, attended memorial walks for missing people, and stayed deeply involved in raising awareness for families going through similar situations. Their advocacy became a lifeline, not just for themselves, but for others facing the same unimaginable uncertainty. They never stopped believing that Bryce might still come home. They never stopped hoping for a call, a sighting, or a moment of recognition. They never stopped searching. What makes Bryce's disappearance so enduring is how profoundly it affects people who hear it. There is something unsettling about a timeline that is so complete up to a point, and then ends abruptly on a quiet lakeside road. Something haunting about a young man who seemed close enough to reach, but somehow slipped beyond the edges of the map. Something deeply human about parents who refuse to stop looking for their child even when the world tells them the answers may never come. In the years since that admit night, Bryce's name has stayed alive because of them, because they spoke it, because they shared his story, because they refused to let the silence drown out who he was, their son, their only child, the young man who loved art, who made people laugh, who was supposed to come home, but didn't. Castaic Lake remains the last confirmed place Bryce was seen. The hills still stand, unchanged. The roads still curve around the reservoir. The embankment where his car was found is still there, a quiet slope overlooking a landscape that holds a question no one has been able to answer. But even in that silence, Bryce's story continues to echo. People still share his photo. People still analyze the timeline. People still wonder where he went and why. People still hope that one day the unanswered questions will finally be answered. But until that day comes, one truth remains constant. The search for Bryce is not just about a mystery. It is about a young man loved deeply, missed endlessly, and remembered fiercely by the people who refused to let his story fade. And so this episode ends not with resolution, but with a reminder. A reminder that some stories stay alive because they are shared, because voices carry them forward, because someone, somewhere, might hold a piece of the truth. Share this story, keep his name alive, because someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Bryce Laspisa, and every shared voice brings us closer to the truth.